words like male and female, for example, when we're having a conversation on gender equality, because those are biological terms. And biology has absolutely nothing to do with gender. Gender is a social construct. It's how culture, society, time has decided what are the roles that men and women are supposed to face in society, what they're supposed to do. And there's absolutely nothing natural about that. And I think the
This
whole
meeting
purpose
is
of a
being
session
recorded.
like this is to challenge those gender stereotypes. So I don't want it to sound pedantic, I don't want it to sound academic, but it's very, very important that the language that we use is very correct, because it does, in a sense, almost ascribe to the issues that we are all here trying to challenge. So I think that was the first thing I just wanted to get on, sort of stayed out there. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that when we talk about gender equality, there's a lot of confusions in terms of what we actually mean. And so I think, again, it was very important that when we have this session, that it shouldn't be just about women. Gender is about men and women. And there are a lot of issues today that men also face as a result of these socially prescribed rules, and kind of expectations that we have of men and women as well. And I think, therefore, any conversation on gender equality has to be very much a conversation between men and women. Just on the top of my head, I was just thinking about this, and one of the most kind of impactful quotes was from Emma Watson, who is the UN ambassador for He for She. And she said, and I quote, "It's time to see gender as a spectrum instead of two sets of opposing ideals." That's very, very important to understand. And at the same time, Ban Ki-moon, who was the former Secretary General of the United Nations, he clearly said, achieving gender equality requires the engagement of, and it's very important, the language, women and men, girls and boys. It is everyone's responsibility. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to talk about these issues. It very much ties in with the goals of this conference to empower young people, to create awareness, and to create global citizens. We have four very young, passionate people on our panel today who are working in their own ways to meet these goals and will no doubt inspire us as well. So I would like to introduce the panel, and then we'll jump straight in. So Rohan Mitra is a third-year student at the American University of Sharjah, pursuing a double major in computer science and mathematics. Wow. He is currently working as a research assistant with the university. Welcome, Rohan. Pooja Agarwal is the founder and president of Girl Up Sydney, SPGen Sydney's club under the UN Foundation. She started Girl Up Sydney with the support of her team in October 2020, and the club has managed to raise a considerable amount of money for several women's charities. Welcome, Pooja. An is a former head of content creation at Girl Up Sydney Club at SPGen School of Management. She is currently working at Unilever as a brand marketing intern, with the belief that marketing communications plays a role in delivering gender awareness. Welcome, An. And finally, we have Akhilesh Bachu, is a graduate in economics from the SPGen School of Global Management, a business consultant and entrepreneur. He aspires to be a driver of change in his home country, Mauritius. He has worked with several NGOs focusing on issues around homelessness and education, as well as raising awareness on breast cancer. Wow, guys, you guys blow me away with your passions and your interests and your kind of literally already you are walking the talk. So I think it's wonderful to have you guys here, and I look forward to a really interesting discussion. So I had prepared some questions which we could start off with, and of course we can have people adding questions in the chat, which we can look at the end as well. So let's keep it as interactive as possible. So I thought we'll start off with the fundamentals, so to speak. Just kind of hearing the conversation in the earlier panel, I think there's often, we talk a lot about gender equality, but I think there's often a lot of confusion about what gender equality really is. People have different ideas about it, and often some misconceptions as well. So I want to ask you guys individually what you think about what the term gender equality means to you, and what do you think are some of the hurdles in terms of achieving gender equality? And we'll start off with Pooja.
Thank you so much, Maheen, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. And if you ask me what gender equality means, I think the best way for me to put it is that regardless of their gender, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, you're not denied any opportunity. your gender should not come in the way of what you want to do or how you want to do it. That, in my opinion, is the definition of gender equality. Now, when it comes to gender inequality, I think there is no real, list of reasons that we can have, because I think it differs from geography and culture, and there are certain things that take place in certain regions that do not take place in other regions. But I think the main thing that we can use to combat gender inequality is transparency. I think someone in the session before the break was also talking about this. Like, if we have information about what's going on in the company, about how everyone else is being treated, I mean, even outside the workplace, if you're well informed about how the other gender is being treated, what they're going through, and they know what you're going through, then you can truly be allies. So I think information is the best way, information and education, to sort of combat what this is.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think the key word that came up for me here is allies. I think that is very, very important to sort of focus on. Rohan, what do you think? Let's get your perspective on what you understand by gender equality, and whether you think that, what are the steps that we have to take to try and bring people together in terms of working as allies?
Right. First of all, thank you for the introduction, and I completely agree with what Pooja just mentioned. And I think one important quote, as you mentioned by Emma Watson, was that gender is now a spectrum, and that's what we need to consider here. Rather than looking at it as something that divides us as humans, we need to look at it as that we're all equal, and we need to start looking at other issues like being together as a society, rather than just dividing ourselves on yet another issue, right? And I think that's something that needs to really be addressed. And I think often education comes into play. I think a lot of gender inequality stems from the beginning, when you're somewhere in school, in terms of education and how you're formed as a person. And I think that's something that we need to address as soon as possible, because we need to talk about starting at the source. And I think cultures obviously play a big role, and we'll probably get to that through this talk. But I think initially starting at the source is what's the best way to combat any kind of gender inequality that might show up later on in later stages of life. I think that's important for both men, women, as long as the whole idea is that everyone is built so that they remember that everyone's equal and not discriminate based on gender. I think that's something that would basically solve gender inequality, or at least reduce it to a great extent.
Okay, An, I see you shaking, agreeing. So let's get your perspective on this.
Of course, thank you, Ms. Ahmad, for these very generous introductions. But to be honest, I really share the view of Pooja and Rohan when they talk about starting things from the source, because I believe like nothing can create such a big mess nowadays without having like a wrong start at the beginning, especially at a young age. So I believe education should be the first start when we talk about gender like equality, and also it has to come from both genders. Education here, it's not just for one specific like male or men or even women. It's for young boys and girls, and for them to understand that this is an issue should start with us, like even parents, millennials nowadays. And I believe like it should start from there.
Okay, Akhilesh?
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. So for me, gender equality is about having equal access to resources, to the same outcomes, irrelevant of what gender you decide to go for, whatever gender you qualify yourself with. For me, it's not only about education, it's about a complete set of change that needs to happen around the mindset of people. It has been too long that people have always thought of one gender to being superior to the other when it's not the case. And I know for a fact that we should not talk about changing people, right? Be the change that we want to see. So I think by changing ourselves first, right, and putting ourselves in the spotlight of the world, kind of being an inspiration of others, this is what is going to really help this world go forward in terms of gender equality. And I think the
Absolutely.
change
Yeah,
starts
sorry.
with us.
Sorry,
I think the
sorry.
change starts with us, and that's
Yeah.
fine.
No, no, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think a lot of things that comes on, what you guys are bringing about is where the change should start. And I think a lot of that has to do with the kind of messaging we receive as young women, as children, young boys and girls. And I think that, and a lot of that has to do with, where we're brought up, how we're brought up. And I think one of the key things we need to understand is that gender equality is not just, it's not just happening in the Middle East, or it's not a South Asian issue. It perpetuates itself globally in terms of, as in the earlier panel, it was about the gender pay gap, or whether it's about, the types of jobs that men and women can do or should do. So a lot of it is about the messaging, whether it's the media, for example. We see so much media misrepresentation that comes through as well. I mean, so I feel that, that is kind of something that is very, very important to sort of address. And just, I mean, I know sometimes it can get very kind of personal, but if you think about yourselves and, where, your childhood, or even when you were at school or at university, what were some of the messages perhaps that you received which kind of put you in a box or stereotyped you, where you felt that, that was in a sense almost like holding you back? So a little bit of that, any thoughts on that?
So when I was a little girl, I really did not like playing with Barbie dolls, and that was something that I think really. I mean, that's the earliest memory I have of being put in a box of people looking at me funny, like kids my age thinking there's something wrong with me for not liking Barbie dolls or for wanting to play with the football. And I think that's where it started, because I think we're not born with this, like Anne rightly said. No one's born with any kind of impression against anything or towards anything, right? These are all things that society feeds us. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think society fed me the fact that me not liking Barbie dolls made me less feminine. And for a long, long time, I believed it. For a long time, I had an aversion against the color pink, because I thought, oh my God, this is going to make me more feminine. And, I didn't want to be put in that box where what I like or what I use or what I, do in my spare time has to define whether I'm feminine or not. I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking. And I know right now we're referring to men and women, but we're aware that there's a spectrum of gender. There are people who are non binary, there are people who are gender
Absolutely.
fluid. And I think this kind of thinking harms them more than we can imagine, because we don't go through what they go through. And for us to accept, that these boxes exist, I think it's very dangerous. And I think that's really my answer to your question. That's where it all started for me. And to be fair, I'm still stuck in it. I'm trying to grow every day. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to see how I can change my thinking. But I think the fact that these were, messages, and this was the information that was given to me as early as 2 or 3 years of age, I think it's something that's difficult to really, completely get out of, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important that you brought up the idea of, we talk about gender and we talk about men and women, but there's, of course, we have to be aware and understanding of the fact that there are many people who don't ascribe to either. And, and we think about our lives, we tick boxes all the time. Any form that you fill out, whether it's your race, whether it's your gender, whether it's your religion, and it kind of, it defines you in a certain way. And that is also fine. I mean, and for a lot of people, those kind of boxes limit your options. And I think that's the main thing to understand. It's not about just ticking a box. It's about how those boxes then limit, what your options are. And it goes both ways. I mean, I think it's important to understand these are issues that not just women face. I think, for the two men on the panel, I'm sure at some point, expectations of being a man or a boy, and what that involves does have an impact on you in a positive, but also sometimes in a negative way as well. Anything you guys would like to add to that? And by the way, I got that like in a generic way and not a sort of biological way. Yes.
Right. So I think you brought up an important point. I think of checking boxes, and I think that was something I really agree with. Rather than it's not just something you fill on a form. It's a role you'll end up having to play out in most cultures. And I think one thing that comes up pretty often, especially with terms of men, is that they're expected to be stronger or like not show their emotions, and that's happened quite a few times and across I think almost every man I know has had this kind of an issue some point through their life, whether it be my friends or my other colleagues. It might be the same idea that generates through all of them. And I think that's something that people have slowly begun moving away from. I think with this whole revolution in terms of gender equality now taking such a big stance, I think that's something we're moving away from, but it's still down there in the beginning stages. So I think something like expressing emotions, I think, is something very important that you need to do. Everyone needs to be talking about what they feel, how they feel about it. It's not that oh, you just need to like box it up and keep it somewhere else. No, it's something. We're all human at the end of the day, and that's what really matters. Humans have emotions, and it's all right to share them. And I think that's something that a lot of people need to begin accepting, whether it's in terms of society or them personally. And I think that's something that we should all move and promote further adopting.
Absolutely. Anybody else would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think we've been bounded by too many things since childhood. Now imagine, as Pooja said, the Barbie doll analogy, right? Apply this to people who are now 50 and 60. They've been nurtured with the same thoughts over and over again. And Pooja's lucky she's still, very early in life. We all are. But these people, right, at 40, 50, 60, even beyond, is it really easy to accept a change? Right, we need to think about that. So I don't blame these people. I don't blame them. It's just the way society has been framed to compel them to think in a certain way. Now, the change in society comes from us, future leaders. What we want people to believe is what we will eventually plant in their head. So let's plant something good eventually and hope for the best result.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's very important to understand that, society has and continues to evolve, and we cannot, of course, we recognize, the things that need to be fixed. I think that's the first step, but I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people are conditioned to think in a certain way. Of course, that is dangerous, no doubt about it. Whether that's racism or whether that's sexism or homophobia or, xenophobia, whatever it might be, ageism, there are so many different issues that exist in society. And I think the key thing about this conversation, panels like this, is highlighting these issues and starting to have those conversations about them. And you talked about toys, and I remember thinking about, for example, Lego. Lego used to be very, very kind of gender specific, and then they realized that you can't create, you're sending certain messages to kids, and you need to sort of rethink those messages, and you need to make it more inclusive. And so now a lot of companies, especially toys, for example, because that does in a sense describe a certain role, like I just said, about fitting in or not fitting in. And so trying to shift the narrative in something as simple as the toys and the options that children have to play with without then automatically ascribing them a certain role in society. And this came to a very interesting point that I was actually, which my next question was actually leading to. And this came to, for example, looking at women that are seen as being very strong role models. And one of the examples I was thinking about was the tennis player Serena Williams. So when she had a baby and she came back, one of her first tournaments was actually at Wimbledon, and she was playing against another tennis player called Evgenia Rudina, and the match was battle. It was titled in all newspapers as the Battle of the Moms at Wimbledon. And a lot of readers were like, this is absolutely ridiculous because Djokovic, Federer, they're dads as well. And we've never had a newspaper title saying there's the Battle of the Dads at Wimbledon. And so I think, in your opinion, does it matter? Does this language matter? Does this continue to perpetuate a culture of discrimination, prejudice, away, for example, how we see women, for example, especially in athletics, for example, where there is a lot of kind of gender discrimination?
I think, that's a very interesting incident that you mentioned, because I remember when this happened, I remember being on Reddit and people, especially men, unironically saying that they could take Serena Williams. She's taking a break because she was pregnant, and now they think that they can better tennis than her. It comes unironically, it comes from a place of them actually thinking that they're better than her just because she's a woman and they're not. And I think that is where the whole problem lies, that a woman in terms of when it comes to physical progress or physical abilities is automatically seen as inferior. And that is why I think newspapers and media houses feel comfortable assigning these titles almost as if, she's a woman and she's a mom now, so, her physical abilities have sort of lessened because she was pregnant. But I don't know how that works because I don't get it. I don't see why someone would do that, but I'm assuming it's because they think that being a mom makes them less than in some way. And like you rightly said, there are a lot of male players who have families, and that's not brought up. I mean, I'm from India, so I can give a similar example when it comes to cricket. We have a famous cricketer called Virat Kohli, and he's one of the best that India has right now. And every time he has a bad match, people blame his wife. And his wife is an up-and-coming actress in Bollywood, and it goes on like, oh, what's Anushka doing at home that Virat's so distracted? Like, not only are you downplaying the autonomy of a brilliant cricketer by saying that his performance can be affected by his wife, you're also assuming that it's only her that it can have an impact on her performance. And the way that women's personal and professional lives just get enmeshed, and I think it happens in a way that it does not happen for men. And I think the underlying problem really is that in a lot of ways, especially athletics, what we're talking about is that men's sports and men's events are what we as more interesting, more superior, more competitive, and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts, any other examples that come to your mind where you could see how the media, for example, plays a very, very important role in perpetuating those kind of stereotypes and those differences, where they can and are very, very positive.
I feel that when you have these kind of wordings, for example, the example you just mentioned, the Battle of the Moms, I think it's also quite up to interpretation from person to person. And I think interpretation is a big role when you come to these kind of wordings being used or something based on our culture. I think a lot of people's culture itself starts them off that way. As I think Pooja mentioned that in our country, India, a lot of the culture lands up promoting this kind of an idea. But if you think about it, just take a moment right now and think about this same title. You could think about it in another way. You could think that, hey, she's just had a baby, which is not an easy feat in any way. Yet she's playing at Wimbledon. She's playing at Wimbledon, and I think that's what you can look at the title as and say the Battle of the Moms. How incredible is that? Yes, there is Federer playing on the side, but then again, he didn't give a birth to a child a couple of weeks before that, right? So it's also up to interpretation. I think culture fuels a lot of our interpretation, and that's where the wording becomes misconstrued in such a way.
Any other insights? I mean, I actually, yeah, sorry, yes.
No worries. All right. So I actually don't. Okay, I don't play sports, and to be honest, I just watch sports for for leisure only. I don't do any of that, so I can't share any information regarding how news has twisted or has bring an awful lights into gender equality. But as it comes to places, okay, currently that I'm working for, so we had a campaign called for Dolph. So Dolph had a very big media campaign when we actually trying to portray a better views for even for young child boys or girls, and they really stress about having the right idea of where they're I mean how they should look and how this is very sophisticated, very fragile age of secondary school can get twisted towards by media or by social media. And they're trying to portray their brand in a way that make their messages across to be on the same page, and they educate people, especially boys and girls, about how gender should be and how they should address one another. And I believe that's one way that communications and also newspapers and branding comes into hand and helping us all to get into the right landscape of gender equality. And for that reason, I look into the good sides of media and brandings and stuff. And that's how they're bringing us to another level. That's helping us in many ways. So that's, I should give kudos to that, but I also acknowledge the problem that's going on nowadays, and especially with the twisted kind of media that got exposed to our young children.
No, absolutely. I think media does play a long way in terms of representation. Absolutely. And of course, these are singular events that I was just thinking about. But yes, I mean, I think, for example, a lot of big multinational companies have started to think about the impact that their campaigns can have in terms of how to represent women, how to represent minorities, how to represent people of color. Absolutely. And I think that awareness is definitely there. I still believe we have still a long way to go in terms of how we, the messaging that's coming through. And I think that's very, very important. And I think at the same time, we have to recognize the fact that a lot of these kind of stereotypes do hold women back. A very recent article in the Harvard Business School Journal said that gender stereotypes hold women back in the workplace. They even make women question their own abilities. And again, I remember there was a study by CNN that said that while men are very, very confident in demanding a salary increase by a large amount, women are very, very hesitant to do so. And the question was, why is this? Why is it that women doubt their abilities, and why is it that certain companies, for example, in a sense, almost make them doubt this ability? And so, some of you guys are working, you're young professionals, you're just entering the workforce. Do you think that companies today, have a long way to go still, or do you think that they are working to try and support and encourage more women to not only join the workforce but stay on as well?
So adding another statistic that I find interesting to what you just said, I read somewhere on LinkedIn that men typically apply to jobs where they match 50 to 60% of their abilities, but women typically apply to jobs where they match 70 to 80% of their abilities. So I think that's very telling of how women position themselves in the workplace and how men do. And I think that's where it starts from, where we believe that we need to be at a certain level before we can demand a certain salary or any work. And men have a lot more confidence than women when it comes to that. Now, the reasons for that can get blended. Frankly, we can have a discussion on that. But I think when you talk about the pay gap, my experience has been while working with my guy friends, we may have gotten internships together where at least at our age there's not much difference in our qualifications as well from the same university, and we're in our last year of our studies, but I've gotten maybe about 70% of what they have. And these being my first few internships, I did not think to negotiate. I did not know that was an option. Because to be frank, I was happy to get a paid internship. So I am openly saying that I didn't negotiate, but I to date I don't know why that happened, because in terms of education, qualifications were pretty similar. If you talk about outside the classroom, he may have done some things that I have had, but at the same time, I've done some things that he has. So, in terms of the gender pay gap, with my limited experience, I think it most definitely exists. But to be fair to companies, a lot of them are trying. In India, there are a lot of jobs where women wanting to join the workforce are encouraged to apply. There's a separate section for them to be able to apply. Now, the fact that we need it is a different story. We should. Yes. I think it's a step in the right direction that employers have acknowledged we need it, and they're trying to take some steps to encourage women to come back after having taken a break for 10 days.
Okay, Mitch, what do you think about, there's this kind of conversation going on that men have to become allies of women in the workforce in terms of dealing with, in terms of the gender pay gap, in terms of promotions, that men should not feel that they are threatened by women working with them. And I think it does put a lot of, and I think, it does put a lot of responsibility, no doubt, on men. But do you think that you can be natural allies, that you should be more importantly natural allies with women in the workforce?
Have you ever seen a plane fly without engines?
No, not that I know
of. The ladies are the plane, and the men are the engines. Gender equality is the plane, and the engines are the men. and the women, both of them. If we want something to happen, then both of us, all the genders, have to work together in perfect cohesion to reach towards that result. Now, the contribution, though, has to be unequal. Listen to my analogy here. Women should not be the one who have to drive this change. I think it is something that the men have to drive. Because right now, the driving power, the steering wheel, is in the hands of the men. It's a fact. So I believe the responsibility of creating a situation, of creating a world where there's equal chances for everybody, lies in the hand of the man rather than the female, simply because of the existing inequalities. These are my beliefs.
What do you think? I mean, you've got a very, your face says a lot when you're sort of, when I'm watching you, so I'm kind of it's sort of picking up on that. What are your views on that comment?
Because to be honest, I really appreciate what Bachu has to say, because like from a women perspective, I really appreciate his enthusiasm of like helping, like men should be the one who's driving the force. And but I believe like we both, like both genders should be driving the force too, because we want to be in the steering wheel as well. So that's why we want to determine our own future. But coming back to the topic about companies and of what they're doing, I believe like it's not the company that per se, but it's more or less about the people within this company that was doing like terribly. And I was going through this kind of experience as well, when like a male line manager was treated me as not of my abilities, but of how he thinks of me, as in like like a girl or a female. Mm-hmm. And it hurts a lot when you know that you have a lot of to offer, but they just judge you by the cover that they see of you. Mm-hmm. And that's something that, I mean, not the company per se, but it's the people that makes those companies that has to change. And that change should start with, I mean, like both genders, as I come back to the first point. So yes.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And it has to be about a lot of structural change. And I mean, the thing is, it is the point about, I think that absolutely it has to be men and women. I agree with Akhilesh that it is not, but I would disagree perhaps about men driving the change because of the fact that they have a structural advantage. I think we recognize the fact that that structural advantage has existed for a long period of time, and we have to address that. But I think the key thing, of course, here is about partnership. It's not about seeing men and women as having different interests or different objectives. The objective is very much about equality for all. But it's also important to understand that, you know, this structure, this decades, generations of structural inequality have had an impact. So in the previous discussion, somebody asked, how long will it take for the gender pay gap to be met? So according to the World Economic Forum, it's going to take 136 years. It was 100 years before COVID-19. COVID-19 has had massive structural inequalities in terms of gender, race, class, sexuality. Certain people have suffered a lot more. And you've pushed back the gender pay gap parity by 36 years, from 100 before COVID-19 to 136. And why do you think that is? I mean, what are your views? What has happened in the last year and a half? We've all been affected by the pandemic, but why is it that women have been affected a lot more than men? We need to think about those reasons and think about what is the underlying factor for that. So what do you think? What's happened? I mean, we've all been impacted, but why is it that women have been impacted a lot more than men?
I think, and I read an article on HBR about this a while ago, where they said that work from home is, and does and will continue to affect women disproportionately, especially in countries where domestic duties will fall more on the woman. Now, this naturally will happen, because if work from home becomes the norm rather than the exception as it has been, women will be expected to juggle everything. Women will be told things like, oh, you're not commuting to office anymore. why don't you just do this as well? And I think it's a dangerous precedent that's being set that way, because and this was what the article stated as well, that when women worked from home in the past year and a half, they focused more on balancing childcare as well as looking into the office, but men viewed working from home as more time in the day to be more productive when it comes to the office. So I think in this situation we also have to look within and understand why is it that we are prompted to sort of think in a way that makes us see. I'm not saying that it's our fault. I understand that these are expectations that society has put on us, but like Anne also said, like we have to grow together, we have to get out of this together. So I think when working from home, the onus is also a little bit on us to see how we can balance everything, sure, but not to the point where it starts affecting how productive we can be at work or how much time we can give at work. And I think the reason why this pay gap has been extended is because people have started going back to office, right? But according to the HBR article, again, more men are able to commute than women, and the current structure at offices is such that how do I say it? Compensation and recognition is based more on what they can see. So now, if you see a male employee in the office, you're bound to think that, okay, this person's commuting to the office thrice a week, so they must be working hard. But the fact is that the metrics that existed before COVID-19 to measure someone's output are no longer sufficient. And unless that's taken care of, unless you're able to find a way to measure someone's output, even when they're not in office, and not sort of give a lot of weightage to someone coming to office, I think unless that's solved, this gap will exist.
Absolutely. That's a very, you've raised some very, very valid points there. Rohan, your views, what's happened?
Right, so I completely agree with what Pooja said, and it makes complete sense that, and in fact, I'm just writing a short research paper on one of my courses about how working from home affects your abilities. And one of the main things I found was that when you're not in office, if a few people are, they'll end up getting recognized more than the people who are working from home. So I completely agree with you, Pooja. But on the statistic you just mentioned, that the 100 years got pushed to 136, just as a mathematician, one thing that comes to mind is a possible reason for this, and I'm not saying that's the only reason, it's just something that comes to mind, is that it's possible that because of COVID, since our economy has already suffered in most countries, it's possible that wage raises in general have reduced. In fact, a lot of employees have taken salary cuts to begin with. So it's quite possible that rather than there being an increase in gender gap because of COVID, which is not always maybe the first thing you'd go to, maybe instead of a gender gap increase, maybe it's that both have fallen together. Hence, both need to move up together. I feel that that's something that we might have to explore in the future when it comes to such statistics.
Well, actually, to be very honest, it's from the World Economic Forum. It said the reason was that more women lost their jobs or left the workforce as a result of COVID-19. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that a lot of them had children who were no longer going to school. So who was going to look after the children? So the automatic, and I'm saying that very sarcastically, decision was that the mothers would give up their jobs or take pay cuts because of the fact that it was their response. And this is not, again, and this is global. This is not like, again, going back to how we perceive certain parts of the world. This was a global issue. And I think this kind of brings me to a very important question that I think about myself as well, being a working mother, is the fact that I believe that the work-private life balance has to change. And I think our understanding of responsibilities in the home in terms of housework, or in terms of bringing up children, or even companies then looking at things like maternity and paternity leave, for example, has to change. Where you have because this is the only way you really are going to be able to ensure gender equality, especially in the workforce, right? Nothing else is going to change that. And a lot of that is then, perceptions of what is a man's job, what is a woman's job, who is responsible. I mean, other than giving birth, at the end of the day, that is really the only biological difference that exists is the actual giving birth to the child. The rest of it is very much gender ascribed roles in terms of looking after your children, or look in terms of housework, or in terms of responsibility. And if we don't change that, and we've seen that with COVID-19, is those expectations that Pooja said on women has to change. And again, the other point that you both raised was about how you measure success or measure commitment to your jobs. That also has to be rethought by companies themselves, because otherwise, we're going to continue to see more and more women drop out of the workforce, which is not going to help anybody, because at the end of the day, we recognize the fact that poverty is gendered, and and it's cyclical as well, right? So you're pushing more and more families into poverty if nothing is addressed here. And so really, what do you think are some of the changes, for example, that companies should take for both men and women to make it more flexible for them in terms of work? I mean, do you think those changes should happen in light of the last 1.5 years? I mean, think about yourselves as students, think about yourselves as young professionals entering the workforce. I mean, what would you like to see in the companies that you work for, or the companies that you would like to work for?
Quite frankly, and okay, this is something I haven't experienced because I'm not a mother, but I think fair, appropriate, equal paternity leave would help both genders. I think it's a very dangerous, a very unfair, and a very sad assumption that a father doesn't need to take time off to bond with his baby. I mean, at the end of the day, like you mentioned, the only thing that's about the woman is that she's giving birth, but a father is a parent, and a father needs to build that bond. So I think, by giving appropriate and equal paternity leave, we are also working towards addressing the fact that men can't or shouldn't have emotions, or men are typically not that attached to their children, or men don't do much. Because I think when you do this, you set the precedent that, okay, because both parents get a month each of paid leave after their child is born, the woman can also return to the workforce faster, because there's someone else who's helping her, there's someone else who's helping her set up a system for when they both go back to work, and there's another pair of hands. And I think the difference that this can make to the woman's career as well as the man's career, I mean, just knowing that your personal life is also affected. Because I mean, again, like I said, I don't have experience with this, but from what I see in the media, if you're a mother in the workforce, sometimes there are allowances made for you that I would personally say are unfair. A lot of times mothers get away with less working hours, or not having to do certain things because they are mothers. And I understand where that comes from, because I think it's a symptomatic way to address the inequalities that society has placed before us. But I think a better way to address this is to look at them as parents. Like, men are often, like I said, they're they're not seen as people who have a lot of attachment to their children. And so if a man was to say it's my child's birthday, it wouldn't have the same effect as if a woman was to say that. So I think recognizing that emotion doesn't have gender, like Rohan said in the first question, we are all humans, we all have emotions, and just recognizing that and putting it into action the best way they can, I think that's a very good first step.
Absolutely. Anybody else would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I see Anne smiling, so if you want to go first, I don't mind. No, all good. Okay. So I mean, great example by Pooja about the leaves and allowances. I think honestly, let's all just stop being judgmental, especially in the workplace. I've been told personally, so I've got long hair. So I've been told if you're a man, you got to cut your hair. But I think if you're a sensible human being, you should cut your words right there and stop thinking as such. I don't think that the appearance of someone or the circumstances that someone has been through or is going through should make a difference as to my working potential, right? Men and women, honestly, in most of the jobs, right? If we remove the biological differences in many of the physical jobs, right? We all have the same potential. It's time for everyone in the workplaces to recognize that, okay, they are different biologically, but they can give the same output. To me, it is beautiful in the way that women think. I mean, Mrs. Hadid, one of the best architects in the world, a lady herself. There are so many women who have not been recognized like they deserved to be. Think of it this way: whenever youngsters are asked about someone who motivates them, it's always Bill Gates, it's always Elon Musk, it's always the same people. Change your examples. There's so many women who did great and who are doing great, who are thriving. Use their example. I think our mindset needs to change about everything, really. Equality is only a fraction of the change that needs to happen in this world, but it is such an important fraction. Stop qualifying a gender with a specific appearance. Everyone has the right to look like they want to look. So to me, that's one major trigger.
Absolutely. I think it's not just gender. It's, you talked about, long hair. People have been discriminated against by the way they dress. We've had a lot of problems, for example, in the US in terms of a lot of African American women have faced discrimination in the workforce because of their hair or their appearances. And I think the key thing is, you're absolutely right. It is about culture, it is about a mindset, but it's also about changing the law. We have to recognize how important the law is and what an important role the state has to play in bringing about these changes in society. Because in a lot of parts of the world, there aren't those laws that protect us because we need. So yes, changing people's mindsets takes a long time, but having the right laws in place also then pushes it forward. So, for example, when we're talking about parental leave, that is something that needs to be done across the board. If you think about something like, for example, something as simple as encouraging women to go back into the workforce would be to have, for example, access to free or subsidized childcare, for example, because that is one of the main reasons why a lot of women often end up leaving the workforce is because of the fact that, they have children and they don't have access to childcare, or they don't have the family support, for example. So, the decision then often lies with them. And very interesting enough, this is where companies can play a tremendous role. And you're talking about role models. For me, one of my biggest role models is actually Indra Nooyi, who was the CEO of Pepsi. And one of the reasons why I was always kind of so inspired by her was because she used the challenges she faced as a young working professional to make that change in PepsiCo globally. And one of the first things she did was she made sure that in every country of the world in PepsiCo, there was free childcare. So that every woman and man who came back to work with their children had the option to bring their children to work while they could. And that encouraged retention, right? That encouraged people to be, wanting to come back to work. So I think those changes come through legislation, they come through companies making those changes. And then of course the much bigger issue, as you absolutely said, is mentally the mindset, the culture. But I think, for example, states, legislation, people of influence are the kind of leaders. And I guess you guys also are. I think we'll sort of end now and let it become question and answer session. But I think these conversations, the fact that you guys are here talking about this, the audience that we have here, this is the step in the right direction. And we have to, we have to encourage this. We have to be proud of this effort that you're making. And I think that you guys are very inspiring in the way you think and in the way you are making those changes. Because sometimes it's just about your mindset and having these conversations with other young people that can inspire them. And I think that is a step in the right direction. And I think this is why forums like you've create that conversation. And so, it will trickle down. And if you start off with yourselves, and as Pooja said, you're not a mother yet, or you're not a father yet, you will change the way you bring up your kids as well, and the opportunities that you give them. And that's how change will happen. Okay, I think we're done in terms of the panel. I think it would be nice to open it up. I've been reading the chat. There've been some interesting points, and I think if anybody has any questions for the panel, it would be a great time to now ask them. Arpita, how are we doing with time?
We do have good 8 minutes
Okay,
till
all right.
our next session. So, first of all, amazing discussion. I was enjoying it so much. And I would love to open the floor for any questions. You can raise your hands, you can unmute yourself, you can type it in the chat box, whatever you guys feel comfortable with.
Yes, let's keep it open.
would love to hear your point of views on this. I was reading through the chat, so we do have a lot of agreements on the topic we discussed, and I think it is, especially when we talk about. So another aspect actually that I was when we were preparing for this conference that came up was how even in schools we face this issue. So I think when I had one-to-one with everyone, this was a topic that I brought up a lot, that in schools as well we are always have these certain classes which are for women and certain classes for men, which I personally faced in my school, and it was an Indian school, where certain sports were only for men. And I was like, why? Even though I don't play sports, but it was kind of discouraging that why it's only men who have boys who have the option of playing cricket, and why not women? So I think it is something that is, as I think even Akhilesh was mentioning, that we need to change the mindsets, having
Absolutely. I think education, schools, I mean, the subjects that you choose, for example, have become so gendered, right? So the sciences are seen as being, what men do, and the social sciences, for example, or the humanities is what, women, and it makes absolutely no sense because, why should you limit yourself to those disciplines? Based on based on biology. So I think, and it's important to understand in terms of sports, for example, absolutely, we clearly see how gendered sports in school is. So while the boys are playing football, the girls are playing netball, and it's like, I don't want to play netball. I want to play football or cricket or whatever it might be, and I should be able to get that opportunity to not limit myself. And I remember when my children in primary school, we set up a girls' football team for them because there were a lot of girls who wanted to play football. And I think that it is changing. I'm always very positive about the fact that there is change happening, and that people are recognizing those kind of embedded cultural societal barriers that exist and are challenging them in terms of options, in terms of opportunities, in terms of going beyond, those stereotypes that exist. Um,
If I may just jump
older
in.
people, yeah, sorry, yes,
Right. So
Rohan,
if I
please
may
jump
just
in.
add on to that before we move topic, there, this I think brings me back to the original point that I mentioned, that it's time we target gender equality at a middle school level, because I think a lot of what you said as the male students going to the hard sciences, whereas the women being encouraged for social sciences, is something that happens right down, let's say, in middle school, right before you choose your subjects. And I think promoting this down there is the most important part. We're already further up. We're already past college, or whether we're in college or further up. And I think by then it's quite late. Now it's more like we're trying to just patch up whatever we have. Like there's already this inequality built up, and we're trying to solve it up here rather than addressing it down there at the source. And I think Anne had agreed with me on that. And I think the idea is we need to start setting people to pick whatever they like straight early on. And I think when you pick something you're passionate about, and I've personally experienced this, when you pick something you're passionate about, you will put in the effort. You will not undermine yourself
Absolutely.
anymore. All this thing about, I think Pooja mentioning about women doubting their abilities, that is going to stop because they're going to be passionate about what they're doing. That's finally what they want to do. So with men are applying for jobs with 50%, meeting only 50% of the requirements, but maybe that's not what their primary requirement was for. Maybe it was just like, okay, you know what, they're just trying to get through with it now. So I think putting people in the right path is something we need to look at immediately.
Which is basically revamping the education sector itself, right?
Exactly.
Thinking about, and it's about, sort of encouraging teachers and educators to be more inclusive and to recognize the diverse needs of people, and I'm not just limiting it to gender. I'm just talking about people themselves in terms of what their abilities and what their interests are. Absolutely, and I think schools do play a very, very important role in breaking gender stereotypes and in encouraging people and you're absolutely right, to do what they're passionate about without thinking about whether that's acceptable or not. A lot of it has to do with societal acceptance, which limits us. There's a very interesting question in the chat. I mean, it kind of goes back to sort of saying older. So I don't know. I guess I am the older generation here compared to you guys. I don't know who we're talking about, but I think the feminist movement or the movement towards gender equality has always been there. I think now the forum and the way we're dealing with is different, but I think that we've come a long way as women and men on the kind of all the work that has been done by feminists and by inspirational people in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. If anything, I feel today we've had a backlash against feminism. And I think that a lot of women even tend to be our worst enemies. And I think we have to recognize that factor as well. That was one of the questions that I had, but we ran out of time. But I think it's a question of not just young people, but I think it's a question of everybody, as you all have said, to start thinking about, the fact that it makes people unhappy at a very simple level, or it limits their opportunities based on their gender. And I think if we think about it intrinsically, as Hillary Clinton said, that women's rights are human rights. There's nothing kind of biological about that. If we start thinking at a very simple level, I think we can bring about that change. Yes, culture, religion, society does play a role, unfortunately. We cannot change everything and we shouldn't change everything, but we need to see what's harmful to whom and address that. I think that's very, very important to do so.
Can I just jump in on this question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I think like one thing that I have like experienced is that older people have a sort of resistance to this, and that's natural because the status quo works for most of them. In that our grandmothers don't want to work because the kitchen is all they've known, and our grandfathers are comfortable with that arrangement. So I think the resistance is natural, but I would like to share something that happened to me a few years ago that made me realize how we can, sort of combat this. I think at their age, what they're going to do is they're going to learn by example. If we are able to set the right example where we don't discriminate between each other or against each other, I think that's something that they might learn from. Because a few years ago, I was organizing an event, and it was me and a guy friend who had gone to check out a venue. And when we went there, the person showing us the venue was, I think, a manager. And he shook his hand and he didn't even acknowledge me for the discussion. And I mean, I didn't like that, but at the same time, we needed the venue. So, I thought it's fine. At least he's giving us a decent price. But, before we walked away, my friend did tell him that, so it would have been nice if you acknowledged my partner because she is actually the head of the department where I work. So I think the final decision will be with her. So I think it would have been a better session if you had acknowledged both of us. And I think the guy was really taken aback because he didn't. First of all, I don't think he expected me to be the head of department and the guy to be someone junior to me. But more than that, I think it was the fact that someone spoke up. And I don't know if he's
Absolutely.
changed. I would like to think that he has because I think the person that this would have worked for chose to not let it work for him, chose to speak up, chose to say that, hey, this is not something I'm okay with. You can't ignore her because she's her. You have to take her into account. And it was obvious he was being sexist. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask me anything. So I think the fact that he stood up for me, I would like to think it changed how that man looked at the world. So I think that's something that I will continue doing. I will continue to stand up for women as well as men whenever I can.
Absolutely. It's about creating allies. And I think the whole theme of this conference has been about creating, allies and working together. I think without that, we're never going to be able to bring about change or deal with any of the inequalities that, we are currently facing. I think anybody else?
I just wanted to pop in and highlight
Yes, of
something
course.
that you brought in earlier about the laws and the policies that need to change. I think many of the laws, many of the policies, right, they're driven by heads of states. Now, what drives the selection of heads of states is obviously the popular opinion. For a change to happen at the higher level, it needs to start at ground level with the common man. So I think it's a big confusion where we go back to square one every time we reach square 100. Who is the one who has to initiate the change? Is it the common man? Is it the policy maker? Who has to do it first? It's the question of the egg and the chicken. Who came first? It's a confusion. It's a beautiful cycle. But I think once we manage to solve this whole issue, this confusion, then change can truly be initiated in the most popular way. Being the change is something really massive, something that we need to be grateful for, that many people are willing to be the change that they want to see. But we need to acknowledge that this whole mindset changing needs to happen from a political decision as well, from political standpoints. Just what I
Absolutely.
wanted to highlight.
Great, thank you. I think that seems to be it, unless anybody has any other last questions or comments. Okay, so that was really interesting, really insightful. Thank you guys for your incredible ideas and thoughts and views, and for some, it's. I hope you continue on this path to be those voices of change, to speak up for anybody who you feel is being discriminated against. I think that's absolutely important, and to continue these conversations. I think that is perhaps the best. That is the only way to continue to be agents of change, is to have a conversation, to recognize the inequalities that exist. And we are very lucky. We are in a position of privilege being here. We have to recognize that, and use and see that as a responsibility for those who don't have a voice. I think that's something that's very important to also be aware of, that with all of this privilege, we have a lot of responsibilities. And I think, you guys are the agents of change. And I think as a generation, you're way more confident, and a way more articulate than we were. So I have a lot of faith, a lot of hope that, it's no longer, gender inequality will not take 136 years. We'll get there a lot faster than the World Economic Forum has predicted. So thank you so much. That was really interesting. So glad I took part. Thank you, Arpita, and everybody else.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Mahid,
much.
Rohan,
Thank you.
Thank you so
Amit,
much.
and Pooja, for having us, for being here and having such an amazing discussion. And I'm so glad that we were able to have you guys on board here. Just so the whole idea behind having you guys on board was just to have the ground zero change, to see that it is not only about popular people who are talking about it, but also about us, just university going students who are trying to make a change. And I'm just so proud of you all, looking at the kind of work you have been actively doing. And moving on, I would luckily happily like to share that we are going to continue the same topic, and we have our next speaker on board. Just 1 second, where is my screen? Yes. We have our next speaker on board, Miss Emma Wallish, who is the founder of Family Friendly Workplaces, a joint initiative launched with UNCF Australia to certify workplaces as family friendly in order to improve gender equality outcomes at work, at home, for both men and women. And it's a great pleasure. I can see the thought process already there in you, and I would love to have Miss Emma continue with this topic and give her insights about it. Welcome, Miss Emma.
Thank you for having me. Can I do a sound check? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. And can you see me?
Not yet. I'm just gonna quickly remove everyone from Spotlight. So I think we'll be able to see you then.
Okay, no problem. Let's do that. And then I'll share my screen as well.
Yes. I